Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Amy Whitehead, and I'm the director of our Community Development Institute at UCA. Welcome to UCA Downtown. This is a space where we host events such as speakers like Charles Marohn from Strong Towns. We have culinary courses and other things that may be of interest to you. We're so pleased you could join us tonight for this presentation from Charles Marohn from Strong Towns. I'm very pleased to introduce Faith Weekly, and she's going to introduce Chuck to us. Faith is a community development advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. She traveled from Louisville to be here with us. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has been a consistent supporter of community and economic development across the St. Louis region for many years now, and it's really been our pleasure to work with them. And so please help me acknowledge the Federal Reserve Bank for sponsoring Charles. Thank you so much. Faith, please introduce us to our keynote speaker for this evening.
Good evening. As Amy mentioned, I am a community development advisor, and my areas of focus are neighborhoods and housing. So I'm very excited to hear what Charles will share with us tonight and also tomorrow morning. But let me introduce Charles to you. Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to friends and colleagues, is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He is the founder and president of Strong Towns. Marohn has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology and a Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. Marohn is the lead author of Thoughts on Building Strong Towns, Volume 1, 2, and 3, as well as the author of A World-Class Transportation System. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is a primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America, and in 2017 was named one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time by PlanetSyn. Marohn is a longtime commentator on KAXE, Northern Community Radio. He currently co-hosts KAXE's Dig Deep program, a monthly examination of public policy issues affecting Minnesotans. Chuck grew up on a small farm in central Minnesota, the oldest of 3 sons of 2 elementary school teachers. He joined the Minnesota National Guard on his 17th birthday during his junior year of high school and served for 9 years. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music, is an obsessive reader, and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. Chuck and his wife live with their 2 daughters in their hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Marohn.
Thank you. Everybody's been so generous since I've gotten here today, so thank you for that. I haven't been to Arkansas for a couple of years. The last time I was here, everybody was very kind and generous too, so I kind of have the impression that's how you are here, so thank you very much. The Twins did make like a flurry of trades the last couple of days, so on the way over here, I'm checking. I got off the plane today and I'm like, have they made a trade? And they did. They made a trade right at the deadline. So we sent our longtime second baseman to the Dodgers for a couple of prospects. So we'll see. It's not our year, but next year. That's the great thing about baseball, always next year. This is actually my favorite presentation to give. I know I'm going to give a talk tomorrow morning, our curbside chat, which is a look at some of the financial realities that our cities are dealing with. But this one is a deeply personal conversation about neighborhoods and about a neighborhood right next to the neighborhood that I live in, a neighborhood that my mother grew up in, my grandparents lived in, I went to school in, and it's a very personal presentation. So I like to give this one, and for those of you that have seen me speak before, This will be a little bit different, and I just thanks for being here and giving me the opportunity to share this with you. I'm from a little town called Brainerd, Minnesota. It's a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Did you just cheer my hometown? Is there some reason why you just like Brainerd? Have you been?
I've been many times.
Whoa, wonderful. Thank you.
My father's parents are buried there.
Oh, okay.
Their lake place was at Star Lake.
Absolutely. So, Brainerd, I grew up on the farm that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents just outside of the city. But Brainerd is probably most known for, besides the movie Fargo, outside of Minnesota. Within Minnesota, we are the Brainerd Lakes area. So if you are a Twin Cities resident, live in one of Minneapolis, St. Paul's suburbs, a lot of people will come up to their lake cabins or their resorts or what have you and vacation in the Brainerd area. Very nice place. Lots of lakes. You can walk a mile in any direction and you will hit a body of water that is very nice. So it is a great place. This is what the area looks like. I said I grew up on a farm. It was right down over here. I live now right up in this neighborhood here in the center of town. This is Brainerd. This over here is the neighboring city of Baxter. You can think of them as basically the same city with just two different city governments. One is the old railroad town. One is the new suburban place with the strip malls and the big box stores and the drive-through restaurants and all that. I'm very involved in my community. I'm an engineer and a planner. I've been here for a long, long time. Part of my job has been to interact with governments, but even after I stopped working locally and started to do stuff on a more national basis, I stay very involved in the community. I'm actually on the planning commission now, but when this project was first proposed, I wasn't. But I'm one of those people who has read all the plans, has looked through the ordinance, looks at the city council agendas, watches the local access channel when the council meeting's on. I'm one of those people. It's a weird group of people, but I'm very, very involved. I know what's going on. So one day when I woke up and I read on the front page of the paper that the city was going to do a project or was proposing to do a project to extend sewer and water out to the airport, I was really surprised. The way this was set up was that on the front page of the paper, it was the reporter down at the state legislature talking about a bill that was being introduced to borrow money. Every other year, we do a bonding bill where we borrow a bunch of money and spend it on capital projects. Everybody gets their little thing. Our little thing this year was going to be this project to run sewer and water out to the airport. I'd never heard of this project. I'd never heard of a study on this project. I've never heard of this project proposed. This completely came out of the blue. It was $7.1 million. That's what they were asking for at the legislature. And just to give you some context, because $7.1 million means different things to different people, our entire city budget is $9 million. So take whatever your city budget is and subtract 20%. That's basically what this project was, 80% of our total annual city budget. Of that city budget, we raise about $3 million a year in local taxes. The rest comes in aid and other things. So you're talking about a massive sum of money. I've never, ever heard of this project, right? How does this project appear just out of nowhere? So what the local newspaper did is they went to, because it's a stringer down at the Capitol. It's someone who reports for a bunch of papers. They don't necessarily know what's going on locally. But they put this report together, and what happens then is the next day, the local reporters will follow up with the local flavor and the local context. So that's what they did. At the time, we were represented by in the House, a Democrat. In Minnesota, it's actually the Democrat Farm Labor Party. We don't have the Democratic Party in Minnesota. We have the Democrat Farm Labor Party. Long history there. John Ward is a really nice guy, a family friend. I like him. In the Senate, we are represented by a Republican, Carrie Rude, also a very nice person. I know her personally. She's very nice. We actually, in Minnesota, just as long as I'm on history, we do have the Republican Party, but if you went back a decade, or went back 14 years. It was 2004 that we changed. From Nixon until 2004, we were the independent Republican Party. So we did not have a Democrat Party, and we did not have a Republican Party. We had our own Minnesota version of those, just to give you some Minnesota context. So they went and asked John, what's going on? Where did this project come from? Why did you propose this in the House bonding bill? And John said, I always listen to my constituents. This is what I was told you wanted. If this isn't what you want, let me know. I'm happy to do what you want. I'm just down here to serve. They went to Carrie and asked her, what's going on? Where did this come from? And she said, I tell you what, we got some deadlines here in the Senate. We've got to get things rolling. We can always pull it back if you decide this is not the thing you want. But I'm here. Let's get this thing going. All right. They didn't really answer the question. And I'm calling the newspaper. I'm like, what's going on? Your reporter's not really answering the question. Finally, the newspaper went and got a quote from the people at City Hall. The City Hall actually put together a press release because they were getting a lot of pressure. The press release said, we made some improvements out of the airport a couple years ago, and the fire marshal has gone out and said we have to improve our firefighting capacity. If we don't do it by a certain date, by April 2016, we're going to get in all kinds of trouble with the state fire marshal. So thus the project. Let's take a brief time out here. Here's what we did at the airport. This was with FAA money coming in, so this wasn't our money. We built an air bridge, I think is what they call it. When you get off the plane in Brainerd, and it's February and it's 20 below, this is how we separate the people who mean it from the people who don't. You get off and you walk down the plane, and then you walk across the tarmac into the building. And I actually was very proud of that. I'm like, this is how we do it here. Now, because people are weak and wimpy, and now we have this little thing that comes out that extends out, and you walk into that in climate-controlled comfort into the terminal, and then you walk outside in cold and get in your car. So we created that. The other thing we did is we built a restaurant and a conference room. So now we can have meetings out there, and there's a restaurant out there. Mind you, we have 2 flights a day, one at 7 in the morning and one at 9 at night. Not exactly prime restaurant hours, but we have a restaurant there now. Because of these improvements, the fire marshal is saying we have to add to our firefighting capacity. I have the disadvantage of being an engineer and knowing what that means. It means you go out and put a little bit of a holding tank in the ground and store some water there so that if there's ever a fire and the fire department comes out, they can just suck the water right out of that and go. It's not really a big deal. Maybe a couple $100,000, $300,000-$400,000 max. We came up with a $7.1 million project to do this. The bill down at the legislature is starting to go through, and of course, I'm looking at the city going, this is nuts. Are we really going to do this? But the talk around town, in the coffee shops and places, come on, Chuck. It's going to create jobs. We have the highest unemployment in the state of Minnesota in Brainerd. Don't tell me you're against a project that's going to create a bunch of jobs. Come on, Chuck. It's not going to cost us anything. The legislature is going to pay for this. If we don't take the money, someone else is going to get it. Why would we not do this project? Think of all the development potential that this is going to create. From the edge of the city out to the airport is about 1.5 miles, 1.75 miles. Now we can hook up people to water and sewer out there. Think of all the development that we could get, all the new growth and investment that we could get from this. You're not against that, are you, Chuck? And then, of course, the big one, let's think of the children, Chuck. The fire marshal has said we need to do this. Are you really going to stand up and say we don't, right? So this thing starts to proceed down at the legislature. They hold their committee meetings, and they go through all this stuff, and they create a bonding bill, and they put it in. They do allocate money to the Brainerd Airport. Of course, it's not $7.1 million. That would be really dumb of them. They've got to spread this money out over a long range. So it's just enough to where we have to do a painful level of local match, right? The local match is not so big that we could never do it, but it's big enough to where it's going to hurt a little bit. What happens locally then is all the engineering firms and contractors and all the non-governmental organizations, everybody who's kind of in the legislative pipe chain, the pipeline for money flowing through the community, steps up and says, we really need this project. The airport is an important part of the community. If we don't have the airport and the airport's not functioning, this community will not thrive. We really, really need this. And at the end of the day, what do you have? You have a project, right? Let me back up. I worked for cities for many, many years doing capital projects as an engineer, as a planner, putting projects together. This is, a very close facsimile of the project development process in every project that I ever worked on. What is missing from this? People. Who said people? I love you. Yes. Yes. There's no actual people involved in this anywhere. This has all been kind of birthed by the bureaucracy, by the inertia of the system, by elected officials, by appointed officials, by bureaucrats within the system have looked and said, this is our priority, this is our need, this is what we want to do. That's okay. We have a system for involving people, right? We don't ignore them completely. We have a public hearing process. We go out and we give people 3 options, right? Option 1 is to run a gold-plated pipe out to the airport. Option number 2 is to do nothing and have our airport shut down by the fire marshal. And option number 3 is this nice kind of moderate option between those two that, oh, by the way, is funded 80% by the state already. Which one would you prefer, right? Right? And we wonder why people get angry. We wonder why people feel that this system doesn't represent them, doesn't respond to them, it isn't working. And I know we've got a lot of people in this room who, on a day-to-day basis, that your job is to make things work. This presentation is going to be a little bit challenging to you because we're very used to working within this system. If you're an elected person, if you're an appointed person, you're elected to represent people. You're elected to make decisions. You're elected to be the decider, right? That's what this is all about. Yet, over and over again, we hear from people, they're not listening to me. The stuff they're doing is silly. It doesn't represent me. It doesn't represent what I think this community should be doing. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I'll tell you, I've never worked for my hometown. I've been an advocate within it. I've been a resident within it. I've been someone who cares very deeply about it. I've worked with communities around my hometown, though. And I had to come to grips at one point with the idea that I could not be angry and frustrated with the decisions that my hometown was making and be comfortable with the way that I was doing business in the other communities I worked with. I had to reconcile that. Because what this is it's a process. It's a process of delivering an outcome. And I can think that I'm smart, and I can think that I grasp it, and I can think that when I'm working as an engineer or a planner for some city, that, I'm listening to people, and I got it figured out, and I know what's best, and listen to me, I'm an expert. And then turn around at my city and say, you guys don't get it, you're out of touch, you're not listening. What I started to realize is that we need to take this system and we need to turn it completely upside down. We need to change this project development process in its entirety. There's a saying out of Silicon Valley that I think is really essential to where this country needs to go. The saying goes like this: if we're looking for innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb. While innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. Everybody in this room will say, I prefer smart to dumb. But as Americans, as people living in an affluent society, we have an incredibly strong preference for order over chaos. We will tolerate a lot of dumb in order to have order. If you doubt me, think of the last time you sat at a traffic signal at 1 a.m, right? You will sit there and sit there and sit there, even though you know it's okay to go. Right, because we value order. That's because we are an affluent society. Let me show you what this looks like from a city government standpoint. Anybody know where this is? Yeah, we're close enough to the place where everybody knows it. Oh my gosh, Strongtown shirt? Thank you. That's awesome. Very cool. I love Memphis. I have been invited many times to work on things in Memphis, and I've gotten to know them very well. It's one of my favorite cities in North America. If you want to see exciting things happening today, Memphis, Tennessee is a place to go. I love the people, I love the culture, I love the attitude, I love everything about Memphis, really. But Memphis has this long history of dealing with their difficulties through means that we would say are orderly but dumb, right? Very top down. The pyramid is one of the kind of prime examples. Exhibit A. Back in the 1980s, the city of Memphis, a lot of desperation, a lot of decline, a lot of hard times. The powers that be in Memphis, and they actually have a group. I can't remember what the name of it is now, but it's like the Illuminati, whatever, their local group of that decided that what Memphis needed more than anything, what would put them on the map, what would make them a successful, prosperous, world-class city, was to have an NBA basketball team playing in a pyramid-shaped stadium down on the Mississippi River. So logic says you build a stadium, and then you go look for a team. And that's what they did. They ultimately got the Grizzlies to move there. Anybody, where is the Grizzlies from originally? Vancouver, yes. There are no Grizzlies in Memphis. They do not exist there. They imported them from Vancouver, where they do exist. So they got the Grizzlies to Memphis. The problem is when the Grizzlies got there, they didn't like this stadium. The city wound up building them a new stadium a few blocks away. This one sat empty for a decade and a half. Here's another little project in Memphis, a contrast to the top-down, here's how we make prosperity happen. Here's another project in Memphis. This is a little street called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue is a former streetcar stop. Back in the 1950s, as the city was doing all the urban renewal and trying again from the top down to fix everything in an orderly way, they decided one of the things they needed to do was to rip out the streetcar lines, and they ran a highway right through the middle of this neighborhood. Without the streetcar stop on this block, with a highway right behind it separating this block from the neighborhood, not only did the neighborhood die, but this block just faded away. Some people out there, fed up with the decline, fed up with the neglect, took matters into their own hands. They went out, they painted, first of all, they worked with the property owners to get the stores swept out. They swept up the sidewalks. They painted their own bike lanes. They painted their own crosswalks. They invited for one weekend businesses to come in and open up and just show people what could happen if someone cared. They had a bike shop and an art gallery and a little ice cream stand. They didn't go get permission from the city. They didn't go get Department of Health inspections. They didn't get occupancy permits or any of that. They just went out and did it. And they said, by the time anybody gets mad and comes to shut us down, we're going to be gone anyway. Let's just go do it. How much worse can it get? That pyramid now is being used today. It was recycled into a Bass Pro shop. Many of you probably already know this. What you may not know is that effort took an additional, beyond the original construction and 15 years of vacancy, it took another $204 million of tax subsidy in order to make that transition. Memphis, along with Detroit, one of the poorest cities in North America, highest poverty rate, highest incarceration rate, highest out of wedlock birth rate, high homicide rate. A city that doesn't have $204 million to spend on a Bass Pro Shop. By the way, I've lost track of the stats. I think it's been open. I think we're 2 years out now. 2 years. It was May of 2016 when it opened. They had projections for the sales tax revenue, and that was how they were justifying all this. At the 1 year mark, they were 50% below what the projections were. And at the 2 year mark, they were something like 70% below what the projections were for year 2. And by year 1 was supposed to be the peak, and then it would tail off a little bit. So instead of doing this, it did this. Very sad. This little project here, though, which, by the way, this is how clever people from Memphis are. Very clever people, very smart people. This is a street called Broad Avenue. The project they did, they called it an old face, or a new face for an old broad. This investment resulted in a $15 million increase in investment, private investment, a 50% increase in rents on those buildings, 25 new businesses, 29 properties renovated, and 17 formerly blighted properties fixed up and taken off the blighted list. Total public investment on the right there, 0. That's chaotic but smart. When we look at the way our cities were built prior to what we at Strong Towns call the suburban experiment, this brand new way of building cities that we came up with during the Depression and then implemented on a broad scale after World War II. If we go back before that and say, how were cities assembled? The defining characteristic that sets it apart post-World War II development from pre-World War II development is the increment of building. We used to build cities incrementally on a continuum of improvement. Places would start very, very small. This is actually my hometown in 1870, but I can guarantee you that this city at one point in the past looked just like that. In fact, every city that was ever built prior to World War II started out as just a bunch of little pop-up shacks. Think of these as little experiments. Some people with some hopes and some dreams. And if things worked out, if all those complex variables came together and the place became a slightly more prosperous, what you would see is that in short order, these little shacks would get torn down and you would get buildings that were more substantial. This is like the next iteration. And this is my hometown 30 years after that first photo. This is in 1904. And over time, the city would continue to grow incrementally. If it were successful, it would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. So after another 40 years, you would get a more intense development pattern. This is the same street 40 years later. Today, we build things in large blocks to a finished state. We're very used to this. This is how we look at everything. This is how we consider things today. This is not how anyone for thousands of years of human history looked at building and development. Everything prior to the Great Depression was built incrementally on a continuum of improvement. You started small and you added on and you added on and you tore down and you rebuilt and you tore down and you rebuilt and you incrementally grew things over time. You built things that were adaptable. You built things that were flexible. You built things that were financially very productive and resilient. If we understand this, it unleashes a whole lot of possibilities for us to look at this landscape that we have created. And a big part of what we're going to talk about tomorrow is how that landscape is financially insolvent, financially struggling. It opens up a lot of possibilities for us to look at that landscape differently. Not as something that's static, but something that is dynamic. And to do this, I want to give you an example, and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this tomorrow, so I'm not going to go too deep into it tonight. This is one that we have shared a lot at Strong Towns, and we're kind of famous for the Taco Johns. People come to Brainerd and they pose in front of the Taco Johns and send me selfies of themselves. I'm like, you realize I'm like 500 feet away from that? You could just come say hi. These are two identical blocks in my hometown. They're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. The one on the left I've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right I've labeled shiny and new. That old and blighted block looks like this. If you look at that pop-up shack block, that 1870 block I showed you, as my city was growing incrementally over time, in the 1920s, the next increment out on the edge were these 3 blocks here. And so what you're looking at is essentially the 1920s equivalent of the pop-up shack, the little experimental bet, the person out on the edge of town who didn't have much, who was kind of poor, who said, I'm just going to put up a little shack, and then hopefully things will work out in this city, and I will get wealthier. I can work here, I can have my hardware store or my shoe store or whatever, I've got, and make it work. They did that in the 1920s, and then what happened? We had the Depression, we had World War II, and then instead of that incremental process continuing, what happened? We just skipped right over these places and started building out on the edge. You can go 4 or 5 blocks away from here, 5 blocks away from here, and you get to what we now call the old mall. That was the mall where I sat on Santa's lap. We now have the new mall where my kids sat on Santa's lap on the exact other side of town. That mall has now been closing because we have a Herberger's there. They're part of the whole Bonton implosion that's happening this year. So a third of our mall is in the process of shutting down. We now have the big box store group. This would have been in the 1920s, kind of the new, on the edge of town, the new commercial investment that people had hoped would continue to grow and become more intense. 2 blocks over used to look just like that one. Of course, it has declined, it has stagnated. The city labeled it blight. We got it torn down, and now we have the new taco drive-through. I took this picture this morning in Minnesota. Just kidding. We do have summer in Minnesota. It felt really hot yesterday back home, and I'll note this, because I noted this because I knew I was coming here. If yesterday I was out in the yard a little bit, I'm like, oh, it's really hot out, and I looked and it was 78. So we tore down the old and blighted block that was here, and now we have the new taco drive-through, right? Everybody was happy about this. It meets the city code now. It meets all the regulations. Everybody was thrilled that we got rid of blight. We got something new. The remarkable thing about this is that when you look at that old and blighted block, even today in its rundown, neglected state, it has a total value of $1.1 million. When we go over 2 blocks and we look at the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, just a different style of building and development, what we see is that the value is so much less. So much less. We're actually collecting 78% more taxes from that old rundown junky block than the shiny and new one. There's more jobs in that old blight block. There's more owners, local ownership. Everything about this pencils out better, except for our kind of cultural expectations of what successful development looks like, right? So when we look back at that Memphis example, how a small little incremental investment in a place like this has huge returns, what we have to understand is that the place is already doing pretty well before that investment's made, right? I'm going to show you this on a broader scale now. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy and his team and I helped them out. We're invited to Lafayette, Louisiana to help them get an understanding of why they were going broke. Lafayette, Louisiana has had a lot of growth. They've had a lot of success. I think if you look at the macro statistics, population growth, housing permits, what have you, everything's green. But at the end of the year, their budget's always deep in the red. In fact, to the point where they have over $50 million backlog of road maintenance. They could triple their road maintenance budget and still fall behind every year, okay? And so the question was, why? Why are we going broke? And what we did is we sat down and we went through and we mapped out every expense that the city had. Here's where all your pipes are. Here's how much they cost to maintain. Here's where all your sidewalks and your roads are. Here's where you're patrolling with your fire department and your police department. We mapped out every single cost that they had. And then we mapped out all the sources of revenue they had. Here's where your property tax comes from. Here's your sales tax. Here's your utility fees and all this. We mapped all this out. And then we took all those maps and we mashed them together. And we came up with what in a sense is a profit and loss statement for the city, a geographic profit and loss statement. There's enough people in this room where I know some people here, there's at least one or two of you who are red-green colorblind, and this map isn't as clear to you as it is to other people. So I'm gonna walk through this kind of slowly so everybody can see what's going on. For those of you that do see red and green, we kind of deal with accounting terminology. So if you're in the red, you're losing money. If you're in the green, you're making money. This is on a parcel by parcel basis. The higher the line goes up, the more the disparity. Let me walk you through what's going on here. There's a green spike right here where my hand is. Goes off the map, it's the highest green spike. That is a new urbanist neighborhood. It's a new urbanist neighborhood called River Ranch. And by new urbanist, what I mean is traditional development style with modern financing techniques. So tight blocks, narrow streets, built all at once to a finished state. It's an open question how well this will do in the future. It's doing fantastic right now, but because it's not being assembled incrementally, it's built all at once, what is gonna happen is that 25, 30 years from now, everybody's roof is gonna fail at the same time. Everybody's driveway is gonna fall apart at the same time. Everybody's house is gonna need new siding at the same time. Everybody's appliances will fail at the same time. There's like an echo effect where it's all gonna fail. Without the ability to go in and incrementally reinvest in things that go into decline, and without it going into decline kind of in different phases, it's all gonna go into decline at the same time, historically what we see is that neighborhoods like this struggle. They reach that point, the little bit of decline that starts to set in, starts to drag the whole place down. The people with affluence move on to a different neighborhood, and you get stuck in a cycle of decline. Right now, it's doing fantastic. In the future, it's an open question. To the east of that, so to the right as you're looking at it, there's an area right here that's all dark green. That's Lafayette's core downtown. They would love to have this block outside here. I would love to have this block in my town. This is a really nice block. The downtown core of Lafayette is not a great place. It's an okay place, not a great place. They're working at it, it's getting better. But like aesthetically, if you went there, no one's going down to their downtown taking photos saying, you know, look at this, look what I found. It kind of struggles. Right now, financially, it's doing fantastic. There's a crescent of green that runs through here. Those are the poor neighborhoods. Those are the neighborhoods where when we went to get an Airbnb, the city staff said, don't go to that side of town. That's where the homicides happen, the burglaries happen. Stay away from there. That's the poor part of town. Financially, doing really, really well. All of this stuff out here is red. All of this. All this out here, up here, over here, all that. What is that? This is your big box stores, your strip malls, your drive-through franchise restaurants, your curvy subdivisions, you know, with the cul-de-sacs and the 3-car garage homes. That's what all that is. I'm going to get into this a little bit more tomorrow, but I think from a bottom line standpoint, just understand that these places here are the kind of very equivalent to what I showed you with the old and blighted block. This stuff out here is very equivalent to what I showed you with that shiny and new. I want to talk about what it means to make a capital investment. I always push back a little bit when people say, run government like a business, or government is just like a family, because it's very different in some fundamental ways. But when you get to the local level, some of those analogies work a little bit. I want you to think through what it means to make an investment. And I want you to have, first of all, think about what a bank does when a bank is making an investment? Because I want to explore the two different mentalities with you. There's a saying in banking that you can't get a loan unless you really don't need it, right? If you desperately need a loan, no bank is going to give you a loan, right? You can only get a loan if you have what? Collateral, good credit score, lots of skin in the game, lots of equity. If you don't really need a loan, you can go to the bank and get a loan. Why? Because banking is a very conservative undertaking. If you are a banker, you are, by your nature, very risk averse. You don't want to lose money. You are in a very low margin kind of game. There's a saying that banks operate by a 3-6-3 principle. You borrow money at 3%, you lend it out at 6%, you get out on the golf course by 3 p.m. It's a very simple, very conservative kind of business, okay? A venture capitalist is a very different kind of mindset. Think of what a venture capitalist is. Is a venture capitalist worried about risk? No. A venture capitalist is running to risk, is embracing risk, but it's strategically embracing risk. A venture capitalist doesn't put all their savings into one risky thing. What do? They take money they can afford to lose, right? So the overwhelming amount of money they have is going to be someplace very safe. Because if you're a venture capitalist, you don't want to lose your money. But you're going to take a little bit of what you've got, and you're not going to invest it in one kind of, thing. You're going to split it up into a dozen different things. You're going to put a little bit of money here and a little bit of money here and a little bit here and a little bit here. And your idea is I know there's a bunch of things that all look kind of good, like they could go. But there's so much going on and there's so much complexity, and I really don't know what the best investment is. If I make 12 of these little venture capital investments, 6 of them are going to fail completely. I don't know which 6, but 6 of them will. 3 of them will maybe make my money back and be okay, but 1 or 2, or if I'm really lucky, 3 of them are going to go to the moon. And they're going to put that dollar I put into it into $100. And it'll make up for all the losses and then some. That's the mindset of a venture capitalist. It's not a gambler. It's a strategic kind of investment. When you go talk to an investment analyst, if you are going to invest your own money, if you've got a retirement plan or you're going to put money aside and you go down and talk to one of the brokerages that maybe is connected to a national brokerage house somewhere, they'll walk you through this process. And they'll ask you, because the SEC requires them to do this, they'll ask you questions like, what's your tolerance for risk? Do you want to go to the casino and put it all on a roulette table? Or do you want to bury your money in the backyard? And what happens is that the questions are kind of designed to have you say, medium, right? I'm not here, I'm medium. And if you go through this, and you can go test this out on different websites where they'll walk you through this process, they'll ask you a dozen questions, and your answer is always medium. And if you're young, it's medium with a little bit of risk, and if you're older, it's medium with a little bit of conservative. But it's medium. On Wall Street, medium, they call you the sucker at the card table, right? You're the one who gets run over. You're the Muppet, right? This is the derogatory term they use. People on Wall Street don't invest medium. What do? They use something called a barbell strategy, where the vast overwhelming majority of what they have, they invest like a banker. These places don't want to lose money. They don't lose money. They're going to make sure that their money is safe. And a little bit of what they have, they will invest like a venture capitalist. They're not sitting in the middle, because in the middle, what happens is you have very limited upside risk and a lot of downside risk. If you're over here, you have minimal downside risk. There's only so much you can lose because everything's pretty safe, but you've got a lot of upside potential, okay? Cities can play this game as well. Let me ask you, If you are a city and you want to make a banker kind of investment, where would you make a banker kind of investment? And in fact, let's ask this question going back to here. Where's your banker investment? If you are a city and you say, we have a limited capital budget, we're making investments in our community, there's a limited amount we can do, we know we don't have enough money to do everything we want, we can only do a certain amount of things, this is all our budget we can get. Where is your banker mentality investment? It's right here, right? It's right here. If you're Lafayette, your core downtown should never lack for maintenance. No sidewalk in that poor neighborhood should ever be broken and cracked. The lights should never be out. The road should never be full of potholes. The ditches should never be unclean, right? Why? That's where your ROI is. That's where your investment is. If you're a banker, the first thing you do is you just go out and take care of the stuff that's paying the bills right now. You just maintain it. That is a smart banker investment. You just take care of what's there, right? If we spent, 95% of our budget on just taking care of those things, imagine what we'd have. Where's your 5% then? This is what I'm going to show you. So I want to go back to that old and blighted block and the Taco John's. When I published that for the first time back in 2012, the people in my town went ballistic. They did not like that at all. They had just gone through this process to get the Taco John's built. They didn't like some smart aleck rubbing their noses in it. They were embarrassed. Where's Emily? She leave? The psychology, the psychology of that was I embarrassed them by speaking outside the family, right? And they were not happy with me. My second cousin runs the local EDA. Another one of my second cousins is the night manager at Taco John's. So I live in a small town. You can't escape these things. But they came back to me, some people came back to me, and they said, Chuck, you're so smart. You think you know everything. What would you have done differently? Would you really have said no to Taco John's? And that question ate me up. It really ate me. It bothered me. Because I didn't know I didn't have an answer for it. Would I have said no to Taco John's? I would have, but I know that that's an irrational thing. I know that the other people on the, I couldn't talk my own dad into saying no to Taco John's. I knew that was an irrational response that would have put me in crazy land, just not an effective way to do things. So I started to think about it. And it took me a while to realize that to answer that question, I needed to reject the premise. Because the premise of it was decline is natural. Decline is acceptable. These neighborhoods are in terminal decline. And the only thing we can do is this rescue remedy. Go in, tear stuff down, and redo it. And once I crossed that bridge, then I started to ask, what are the good investments? How would I have kept that from becoming an old and blighted block? And what we did, I had a team of friends. We went out and we spent a year in the neighborhood with that old and blighted block and at Taco John's. So this is the neighborhood north of there. There's the Taco John's right there. There's the old and blighted block. My office is in the rail yard, which is right here. My house is in the neighborhood right over here. So right next door to where I live. Just as long as we're friends a little way. That's where my mother went to school. It's where I went to school. It's where my kids went to school. My grandmother lived right over here, and that's where my mom grew up as well. So this is there's a lot of my family members buried in this cemetery right here. So I know this neighborhood very well, and I said, I don't think this neighborhood should continue. It's in decline. It's the wrong neighborhood to live in. It's the wrong neighborhood to buy a home in. If you buy a home in this neighborhood, you're probably going to get poorer, not wealthier. It's that kind of place. And so we spent a year out here, and we said, basically, where are people in this neighborhood struggling? What could we do out here? We don't have any money. We don't have a lot of wealth. We don't have access to capital. All we've got is like a passion for this place. What could we do to kind of nudge it in a different direction, to send a signal to people that, hey, we're not walking away from this neighborhood. We actually want this neighborhood to succeed. And we did things over the course of the year, like we had a scavenger party where we brought people out, had a photo scavenger hunt. We did little projects where we'd go out and stripe narrower lanes on streets overnight, put in crosswalks overnight, and then watch how people use them. We would just walk around the neighborhood and talk to people, say, can we walk with you and experience things the way you do? So we spent a year out here trying to understand the neighborhood as if we lived in it, to the best we could. Not by going out and saying, here's what I would do, but by going out and saying, how can we understand the way you live here and the struggles that you have? And at the end of that, we came up with 8 projects that we thought the city could do that would make life in the neighborhood a little bit better. Things that would improve the quality of life for people that were there and, in a sense, signal to the marketplace that we weren't walking away from this neighborhood, that this neighborhood had value, and that we as a community were committed to having it improve and become a better place. I'm going to go through these 8 projects now real quickly. This is, let me go back here just real quick. This is our first project. This is our second project. These are good orientation projects. East and west main road through the neighborhood, north and south main road through the neighborhood. This is the old mall I mentioned earlier. There's now a grocery store attached to that mall, pharmacy attached to that mall. And then I said the school here earlier. So let me walk you through here. This is the first one, main east-west road through town. This is one where we did a little speed study on. People said, we don't let our kids go out here. We don't walk around here. We don't cross this one because the cars go too fast. It's not a lot of cars, but the cars that come through are going really fast. We did a speed study. We found that 2 out of 3 cars went over 30 miles an hour through here, neighborhood street. We went out at 5 in the morning and did some striping of the lanes. We took actually chalk that you would chalk a base path with on a softball field, because I got that gear, and chalked in some narrower lanes, and then went out and did a speed study. And what we found is that over a 2-hour period, only 1 car in almost 300 went over the speed limit. So we said, let's just go out, and as a simple project, let's just stripe in narrower lanes. We can use that extra space for bikes if you want. You don't necessarily have to, but let's just make sure that the driving lane is a little bit more narrow so that we create some edge friction and slow down the vehicles a little bit. This is then the north-south street that connects to that. When I put this one together, people started to get excited, like, wow, you have light rail, Bill. We have an old abandoned rail line that goes out to the industrial park. They don't have a icon for old abandoned rail line. The closest thing is a light rail, but that's what that is. Nonetheless, the lanes in here are 16 feet wide with an 8-foot parking lane. None of it is striped. You'll notice here too, there's no sidewalks at all. So if you're walking down this street or biking down this street, this is like the epitome of a drag strip through the middle of a neighborhood. What we said is, let's go out and stripe this one too. Let's stripe this one a little bit differently. Let's stripe the parking out a little ways from the curb. There's no sidewalk at all here on either side. So let's create a lane there separated from cars driving where people can feel a little bit safer biking and walking. Let's create a little bit of distance between the cars moving and them, and we'll put the parking right in between. When we go over now to that old mall and the grocery store, what we saw is that a lot of people in the neighborhood walk to the grocery store, and they kind of funnel through 2 pinch points in the neighborhood to get them there. Both of them are on a street where the cars drive very fast. This is one of those crossings right here. What we noticed is that out in front of the grocery store, they have this little cross-hatching, and people tend to slow down and look for people walking. There's no sidewalks here, there's no crosswalks here, there's nothing to indicate people would be here crossing. So we said, let's just put the same cross-hatching that you've got in front of the grocery store, let's put that here at this intersection, and just signal to people driving through here that, hey, keep your eyes open. There's going to be some people who are trying to walk across here. South of there, we had a similar kind of crossing, but a little bit different geometry. We didn't think that the crosshatching would work here, but we did test out a temporary crosswalk and found that people reacted to that. That did have a little bit of impact on the cars. It certainly made people feel safer. And so we said, let's just put that in there at that location. When you got across there then, you have this problem, and this is kind of the same photo, where you could see the curve radiuses here are really big, and the street is really wide. What would happen is the cars that come flying through here, the drivers would go around this corner really fast. And we actually saw people walking through here where they were just walking along, and a car would come around, and they would dive into the snowbank because, you know, they were unsure of what the driver was going to do. What we said is, this is really, really wide. These were like 26-foot wide driving lanes. The reason they did that is because this is our commercial section, and the commercial section is supposed to have parking on the edge. No one parks here because there's huge parking lots on both sides. So all that extra space is just not needed, not necessary. We said, let's put in a double white line and delineate the northern 10 feet just as like a respite place for people who want to walk. So you could still have two 14-foot wide lanes, like obscenely wide lanes to the south of there. There'll be no impeding traffic flow. Everybody can go through. You can even go fast, I don't care. But just give us a little bit of space on the north side where people can feel like they own that. Like, I am allowed to walk here, and you're not supposed to drive here. This is the north side of the neighborhood looking at the park. There's a park on the north side of this neighborhood. This is what it looked like from the street. So standing in the street looking at the park, this is what you saw. They were getting a lot of complaints about drugs being sold in this park and other nefarious activity. That the police department said, we'll step up our patrols and we'll put some cameras in this park. We suggested that they just trim the trees. Sorry, I advanced too quickly. They just trim the trees up so that the people can see out their door into the park. When you can see things, nefarious activity seems to disappear from those places. So let's just open this park up so that people can see it and interact with it. One of the reasons why it's not been opened up is because this is what it looks like when you get on the other side of the trees. Not a lot of maintenance going on. Nobody really cares much about this park. In the year we were out here, except for organized events, so there'd be a softball game here at 7 o'clock, we never saw any kids playing in this park. This neighborhood is full of kids. They would go to the school. No one ever went to this park, ever. We said, let's just get out here and do some basic thing. Let's plant some seedlings out in that outfield, out beyond the fence, to kind of create a nice little buffer to that abandoned industrial area. Let's plant some trees down the first baseline, so maybe someday someone can sit under a shade tree and watch a softball game. Let's plant a couple of trees out here. I actually, this was kind of snarky of me. We had just built you'll have to take my word for it. We built a really dumb expansion of a road, and part of that was we got like landscaping. We got like $1.2 million of landscaping grant to put trees in the middle of this like boulevard out on the far edge of town. It was a shortcut. It was a really dumb project. I said, let's go dig up those trees and put those in the park where there's people so that instead of driving by trees, we could actually sit under trees. That didn't earn me a lot of love, but that was my suggestion. And then this one is probably my favorite. There's a little street that runs north and south that as a planner, I looked at it and I said, this street has the best bones of this entire community. You can see that the houses kind of line up on both sides. They're oriented towards the street. Back in the day, we did used to have a streetcar. We had one streetcar that ran from the mill to the downtown and back. It ran right down this street. So the street geometry is really great. It's still kind of narrow. They've got good sidewalks. They've got nice boulevards. It's nice spacing. This is a really nice street. If there's going to be a revolution on the street, it's going to happen right here, starting here. What is this street missing? Back in the 1980s, we had Dutch elm disease come through and wipe out a bunch of the mature trees. And the city did not want to put them back in because maintenance issues. If they ever want to go in and widen the street, now they got to fight with residents about their trees. So they've never been put back in. There's a study, and I'm gonna say this with a bunch of caveats. There's a really good study from Portland, Oregon, which your city's not Portland, my city's not Portland. Portland is a crazy place full of weird people. But there's a study that said for every street tree, for every street tree on a street, the property values of that street are $9,000 greater. Okay, even if that's $900 in my hometown, the street trees are $50 a piece. Let's go out and plant them, get them in. We're going to make our money back. This is a good investment, and it will help to create this revolution on this street. So here's my 8 projects. This is a recommendation. If you want to read this, you can just go Strong Towns Neighborhood First on Google, and you'll get this report that goes through all of these projects. But I want to show you what these cost. My city finished that project out to the airport. We took the money from the legislature, which is like a contract that we agree to do the project. Then we went forth and did the project. After all the bidding, the change orders, the construction faux pas, the final cost, $13.5 million. The total cost of these 8 projects, $16,700. What happens if we go out and we make $16,700 of minor investments in this neighborhood to improve the quality of life, and nothing positive happens? Nobody wakes up tomorrow and says, oh, somebody cares. I'm going to, improve my own property. Wow, this neighborhood's going in the right direction. I think I'll do that porch addition, or I'll paint my house, or I'll plant some shrubs in my front yard. What if like none of that happens? Okay, we're out $16,700. Big deal. Next year we go try something else, right? But I think that we've identified some things that will work. Because we went out, and instead of deciding from the top down what needed to happen, we observed where people were struggling, and we asked ourselves a simple question: what's the smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? And I am convinced that if we do this day after day, week after week, year after year, in neighborhood after neighborhood around the community, we can, for decades, make small, incremental, quality of life investments that are both high returning and make things better for people in the real world. Jane Jacobs famously said, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. We have to completely change how we make capital investments. This is a revolutionary approach. And I'm not pretending that this is easy or that we can all go home tomorrow and do this, but we have to start moving in this direction. Because the high returning investments we have today are not these big top-down things. They are the small things. And they're the things that really matter in people's lives. Thank you for coming tonight, for having me here, and for being part of this. I really appreciate your time. We need to be completely vacated from here by 7 o'clock.
Yeah, I
So
think we can take a few questions if someone wants to. And you wanna-
I would be more than happy if someone has a question. Also, I'll let you know, I did bring, and I'll have whatever doesn't go tomorrow. I brought 10 of these. I gave one away. I traded one. Someone brought me a book because I love to read, and I traded them. If you would like one of our books, they're $10 each. We're just trying to cover our costs, but I've got 9 of them here. If you want to come up afterwards and just grab one and leave your money, that's great. If you want to get a hold of me, I put my business card up here too, and you can just grab one of those. Please, anybody have a question or something they want to talk about? Go ahead.
Your ROI study that you did?
Yes.
Was that just tax revenue versus sort of capital investment? What did you?
The ROI study we did in Lafayette, it was an annual cash flow study. So the idea was, it was not just capital investments, it was everything. So it was police protection, city hall overhead costs, fire protection, transit. We try to grasp every cost and map them out. And some of it's a little fuzzy in the sense that, like, what is the value of holding an election? Well, we aggregated that as like an overhead cost to everybody equally. But other things like, transit service or sales tax revenue, these were things we could allocate to parcels. We spent a lot of time doing that. It was a very deep, intricate study.
Was it allocated equally, or was it?
There were different ways we allocated it depending on what it was. So we can talk about that. We did a whole, because we've had so many questions, we've had that question many times. We actually did a whole webinar where we went through and explained what we did. Because for roads, if you live on a dead-end cul-de-sac, it's basically like a private driveway. For those, we allocated something like 95% of the cost to the people that are there. Because you can technically drive on it if you want to, even if you don't live there, but it doesn't have a lot of value to you. The main street through the middle of town, that got allocated a higher percentage to the community as a whole, as opposed to those exact property owners. The reason, the way we came up with that is we did a network node analysis. So we said, if you started here and you wanted to go here, what are all the different ways you could get there? And then we ran that algorithm, and it took like 40 hours for it to spit out every iteration of every road. And we came up with a percentage of like how much you could use it, and we used that to allocate it. So it was things like that.
Hold on, okay. Well, one of my questions, Chuck, is
Yeah.
right now in Central Arkansas, we're about to spend almost $700 million on a new 10-lane bridge that will go directly through our central business district, Little Rock, our capital city. And there's a lot of opposition to that. Hundreds of people, neighborhoods, and others, many planners who do not think that that's the appropriate or right thing to do. So what would you say we need to do to change the hearts and minds of people who are in decision-making processes, like at our state transportation department or our regional transportation planning agencies, whenever the public feedback comes back that it's not something that's wanted, but we're still gonna do it anyways? $700 million, and we can't maintain our highways in our state.
Your question was, because there's two aspects to this. And one of them, you said, how do we change their hearts and minds? And I think that is a very important question, and I think we have to deal with that one. I'll remind you that I'm an engineer, and so hearts and minds are something I'm working on. I am married, I have 2 daughters, they're helping. There is a shift going on in this country, and I think we need to keep nudging it. I mean, our whole movement is about nudging this along. People are waking up to the fact that we can't afford to maintain what we've already built, let alone build anything more. Right now, the head of the Federal Highway Administration used to be the DOT commissioner for the Iowa State Department of Transportation. Him and I did a seminar presentation together, and he stood up and said, a decade from now, we will have fewer lane miles than we do today in Iowa. Why? Because we don't have the money to maintain the ones we have. We'll have fewer bridges, we'll have fewer overpasses, we'll have fewer lane miles. Now he's the head of the federal DOT, so he knows this, he understands this, yet he's in a system, a paradigm that is saying, build more, build more, build more. I think that we have to, I don't think we'll solve this by lashing ourselves to a light pole and saying, you won't build this bridge. I think we maybe need to do some of that. I think we need to show up at meetings at the local level and push back on these things and say we don't want it. I think that's all productive. But I think culturally, as a broad part of our cultural conversation, we need to get to the point where we are sick as a people of spending our money this way. And I just want my damn road fixed. Like, I don't want you to build a 14-lane bridge. I want my damn road fixed. And if we get to that point, I think that the inertia of the system will start to change. Right now, there's a huge feedback loop that politicians get and project funders get. And I started with the Brainerd example for a reason. That came from the engineer and the planner at City Hall. And they brought it forward and they got funding for it, and all of a sudden it had all this momentum. If the people in the system were getting feedback from the public that like, this is don't do this, when those things start to bubble up, they're gonna say, just go work on something else. Go work on something else. So I think it's a long-term, you keep pushing back on this really disastrous bridge project. It is a bad project.
So are you aware of it?
Yeah, yes, to a degree. I won't say I'm intimately aware of it, but I know the broad outlines. Keep pushing back on it where you can, but I think as a cultural conversation, we need to talk to each other about why this isn't working. A big part of Strong Towns, the reason we have focused on creating a movement of people as opposed to going out and doing studies here and plans here, the reason we focused on a media message and sharing it is because we need to change our cultural consensus. When we got out of World War II, there was a political consensus and a kind of a macroeconomic consensus that if we didn't do something radical, we would go right back to Great Depression. And what we did is we basically sold to, and you can label it however you want, the middle class of this country. We sold to them a new way of living that they could buy into. And we essentially structured an economy around that. And what you see is that all these age-old obstacles fell away. What we need to do today is essentially reverse that. We have a different cultural understanding today. We have different cultural sensitivities and awarenesses. I think we need to take and step back and say, how do we activate those for a style of living and a quality of life that broadly represents who we are and what we want to accomplish? And if we can culturally agree on that, the engineers, the planners, the politicians, the bureaucrats, all these things will fall in line behind that. But it's a cultural shift. We can't go to them with data and engineer speak. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to know the process you use to arrive at those 8 projects.
What's the process we use to arrive at those 8 projects? I'm going to say this in a very concise way, and I can elaborate on it if this is not satisfactory, but let me say it, because I think it's actually like ridiculously simple. You go out and with humility, you observe where people are struggling. And you do that by observing. And when I say with humility, what I'm really saying is that you don't go in with a pre-designed notion of what it is. You actually go out and say, I don't know, I'm going to observe. You walk with people, you walk behind people, you test out different things and see how they react to them, and you ask them in the moment. I actually wrote a piece about this on our site this week because I was in a meeting last week, and the questions in the meeting that the planners were asking was, what's your favorite thing about the city? What was one thing that you'd change? What do you, and the people in the meeting didn't know how to answer. Then when we started asking them, like, how did you get here today? Well, I walked. Is it safe to walk? No, it's not safe to walk. Can I walk with you and experience it with you? When we can bring it down to that kind of thing, we start to collect data and understand. So you humbly observe, step 1. Step 2, you ask yourself, what is the smallest possible thing I can do right now to address that struggle? It's not a comprehensive reworking of this entire system. It's not a $20 million project to get the... What is the smallest hack I can do right now to address this problem right here in front of me? That's step 2. Ask that question, answer it. Step 3, go do that. Do it right now. Create priorities to go out and do those things over and over and over and over. Step 4, repeat. And just do that. And if we simplify down to that, all of a sudden we just become action machines, right? We don't have to have a 20-year plan. We got to have a 20-year vision. Where do we want to go? What do we want to do? But we don't have to have every detail mapped out. We don't have to spend, years in committees planning things. We go out and we iterate. And by the way, if you step back and you look at natural systems, this is how nature works. If you step back and you look at successful businesses, this is how Google came about. This is how Amazon worked. Every successful major business today, this is what they've done. They've iterated. None of them sat down and said, we're going to do Google AdWords, and here's a big committee where we're going to figure out how to do this. What did they do? It was like an experiment. They tried things. This is a scientific process, and we can put this to work in our communities to incrementally make them better places again. It's almost too simple to sound believable, right? And one of the problems that I run into is that people are incredulous. They're like, well, if we don't have a committee and we don't have a meeting, and how can we do this stuff? Just go do it. And if you screw it up, it's so small, just fix it. Just do it again, do something else, try it again. This is actually how our cities were built. Every great city was built this way. We can do it. It's not beyond our capabilities. Last question, please.
It seems to me that with what you're advocating, you might have a great deal of pushback from elected officials because you're talking about something that occurs outside of the election cycle. A big flashy project
Right.
can be done within an election cycle.
Right.
How do you get the buy-in from the elected officials?
Well, I'm not elected.
I will
yet.
give
Got
you,
me, so.
but I will give, let me answer that, and I'm going to answer that in a very specific way that I think is really important. There's a narrative, and I don't think it's without basis. I mean, we can look at the federal elections and the federal political process, and we're all disgusted by it, right? And I think, and that's not a partisan thing. I think we're just all disgusted. Whatever your party affiliation is. And I think there's a natural tendency to ascribe, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm saying I think as society as a whole, there's a natural tendency to ascribe bad motives to the actors in that destructive, dysfunctional play. Whether we do that from a partisan way, like, that side of the aisle, not my side, they're motivated by this bad trait and this bad trait and this evil thing. And, both sides can do that. I have met, before I started working for Strong Towns, and really since I've started doing this Strong Towns thing, I have met a lot of politicians, a lot of them. I like them. Like, I'm saying I like them as human beings. I have yet to meet one. I've met a lot of them that I didn't agree with. And I met a lot of them that I thought had the wrong interpretation on things. And I met a lot of them that would act the way you're saying, like, if I don't bring home this project, I'm not going to get reelected. But for every one I've met like that, I've met 5 who are like, I want to do the right thing. I want to do a good thing. I ran because I had ideals. I ran because I had things I wanted to do. So I think that there is a system in place where we as the public reward people for getting things done, even if getting things done is really destructive. And I actually don't think it's the politicians that need to change. I think it's us that needs to change. I think that we need to start asking for something different, and I think we need to start rewarding people who deliver that. And if we can define what success looks like even if it's not the way we go about it now, I think our political structure will respond to that. I've seen our political structure respond to that. Here's where I think we have the hardest problem. It's not with the politicians, it's with like the next level. If you, okay, I'm an engineer. I used to do consulting for cities. It's really scary to have a model of building that is more earthy and incremental than it is doing a big project. Not because I don't think it's better, because I know how to run my company and make money doing this, and it's stable and it's safe, and I don't know if I can feed my family if I do this, okay? I have been a city planner. City planner, you have a certain amount of power and authority given to you. A certain amount of prestige that comes along with that. I can shape and influence things. If you change that around, where now it's not my vision, but it's your vision that I'm actually serving and following, that's a whole different mentality of a person. It almost takes someone from being like, I want to be Caesar to I want to be Jesus, right? And those are two very different mentalities, right? One is I want to lead, and the other one is I want to serve. And so I see the biggest resistance coming from basically what would be the professional class of people, and they have the ear of the electeds more than you do. And that's where I think the tension and the struggle is. That's the tension in our movement. If you go read the piece that I wrote on Monday about public engagement, where I went through this exact kind of scenario of you go out and you humbly observe, you ask what the next smallest thing. Go read the comments, and you can see the people who are outside the system, and you can see the ones that are within it. And if you click on like their profile and like look, you'll see like, oh, you're a planner, oh, you're an engineer, you're part of the bureaucracy. They're like, no, we can do public engagement better if we just have better outreach and better meetings and longer agendas and, put it online. And no, you can't. You got to go out and serve. So I am optimistic about our political structure, despite the dysfunction and craziness. I think that we have far more power than we think we do. And if we're willing to step up, talk to our neighbors, start a conversation about a different vision, I think we can do a lot more than what we think we're capable of. And I think the political structure will respond.